Welcome to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring the random prompts of Daniel Rosehill as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters. Join us for deep dives into AI, technology, and whatever other random thing Daniel finds fascinating today. Subscribe on Spotify or your favorite podcatcher. Now, today's episode.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts. Here's Daniel's prompt.
Hi there, Herman and Corn. So agentic AI is very much a relevant topic at the moment in the world of AI. And I've been working with AI agents for a while now, or I should say, it feels like I have, because I'm never quite sure what is an agent. Where does that hard distinction fit? One question that I think kind of remains open for discussion in AI topics is we used to have these things called custom GPTs in which you could just add a system prompt to a model and get sort of responses about that are guided in a very specific direction. And I continue to find those actually some of the most useful and transformative AI workflows. But over the course of the last year, I began building N8N things with tooling and really building bona fide agentic AI workflows where you've got an agent that kind of orchestrates and hand things down to sub-agents, and using Claude Code for that purpose as well. But I feel like the problem with the discussion and some of the hype around agentic AI is that people are trying to define very different things under a very wide bucket called agents. For example, the case of I'll give a simple example of one of my first N8N workflows, which was a very useful, practical, and I think relatively straightforward agentic application. The workflow was an agent that ran once a day, consumed the news, and created a customized summary based upon a very precise system prompt what it was looking for, and then sent a email. Now, I feel like most people would not dispute that that's an agent. It's taking action. It's using an AI tool as the brains, but it's not really autonomous. It's running at a certain time every day, and it doesn't have autonomous tool selection, so it's not saying maybe found success with to date that really do involve kind of that long-standing, persistent agentic execution. And because ultimately we're talking about code at the end of the day that has to live somewhere, whether it's on a server or serverless deployment, where are these things actually being deployed, and what do they cost in terms of their usage? If you can't predict when it's going to run, what kind of mechanisms are there for cost control for those who kind of want to use something effective, but they don't want to blow up, a huge bill with API costs?
Hey everyone, welcome back to My Weird Prompts. We are at episode 261, and I have to say the start of 2026 has been pretty wild so far. I am Corn, and sitting across from me, as always, is my brother, the man who probably has more browser tabs open than most small businesses.
Herman Poppleberry here, and you are not wrong, Corn. My computer is currently screaming for mercy, but the research is just too good to close. We have a fantastic prompt today from our housemate Daniel. He has been deep in the trenches of building things lately, and he is hitting on something that I think a lot of people are scratching their heads about right now.
Yeah, Daniel was actually showing me some of his setups in the kitchen this morning while the coffee was brewing. He has been working with agentic AI workflows using things like N8N and Claude Code, and he is feeling that classic tension. On one hand, you have these simple custom GPTs that everyone uses, and on the other, you have these massive multi-agent orchestrations that feel like they are building a digital workforce.
It is a huge distinction, and honestly, the industry has done a pretty poor job of defining what an agent actually is. People just throw the word agent at anything that has a system prompt these days. Daniel is asking where that line is drawn, where these things should actually live, and how we keep them from accidentally spending our entire life savings on API tokens while we are sleeping.
That runaway cost fear is real. I remember back in episode 230 when we talked about the agentic dilemma and the idea of a kill switch. But today I want to get more practical. Let us start with that first part of the prompt. What is the actual difference between a custom GPT and a bona fide agentic workflow? Because to a casual user, they might look the same, right? You type a prompt and stuff happens.
Exactly, and that is where the confusion starts. A custom GPT, at its core, is basically just a wrapper. You have a large language model, you give it a personality or a set of instructions in the system prompt, and maybe you give it access to a few tools like a web search or an image generator. But it is fundamentally reactive. It waits for you to say something, it processes that one turn, and it gives you a response. It is a very linear one-to-one interaction.
So it is like a very smart clerk. You go to the window, you ask for a document, the clerk goes and gets it, and then they sit back down and wait for the next person.
Precisely. Now what Daniel is building with things like N8N, that is where we move into agentic workflows. The key difference here is autonomy and the loop. An agentic workflow is not just waiting for a prompt, it is often triggered by an event. Daniel mentioned his news summary agent that runs once a day. That is a proactive system. It wakes up on its own, it looks at the news, it decides what is important based on its internal logic, and it executes a series of steps.
But wait, is a scheduled script an agent? If I just write a Python script that scrapes a website every morning, is that an agent? I feel like we are missing the intelligence component in that definition.
That is a great point. The intelligence is the brain. In a traditional automation, like a standard Zapier flow from 5 years ago, it is all if this then that. It is rigid. If the website format changes by 1 pixel, the script breaks. An agentic workflow uses an LLM as the reasoning engine at each step, so instead of saying, scrape this specific HTML tag, you are telling the agent, find the top 3 stories about renewable energy today. The agent then has just to reason through to create the wild beam.
Okay, so the distinction is the degree of reasoning and the ability to handle ambiguity. A custom GPT follows a recipe. An agentic workflow is like a chef who knows the goal is a 3-course meal and can adjust if they find out the store is out of onions.
I love that analogy. And then we go one step further into what Daniel called complex agentic workflows that orchestrate sub-agents. This is the manager-worker pattern. Imagine one agent whose only job is to be the architect. It receives a complex goal, like build me a marketing campaign for a new coffee brand. The architect agent does not do the writing. Instead, it breaks that goal into subtasks and spins up or calls upon specialized sub-agents. One for copy, one for image generation.
This is where it gets really interesting to me, but also where I start to see the potential for chaos. If you have agents talking to agents, you are basically creating a small digital company. But in 2026, how reliable are these sub-agent handoffs? I mean, we have all had that experience where you play a game of telephone and the message gets garbled by the third person.
It is the biggest bottleneck right now, the handoff. In 2024 and 2025, we saw a lot of these systems fail because the manager agent would give vague instructions to the sub-agent, and the sub-agent would hallucinate a solution. But now, with models like Claude 3.5 and the newer iterations we are seeing this year, the instruction following is so much sharper. We are using things like structured output, where the manager agent has to provide the sub-agent with a very specific JSON. It is less like a conversado.
So it is about adding guardrails to the autonomy. Daniel mentioned Claude Code specifically. That is a great example of a tool that feels very agentic because it is actually looking at your file system, running tests, seeing what failed, and then iterating on its own code. It is a closed loop. It is not just suggesting a snippet, it is trying to solve the problem until the tests pass.
And that brings us to the second part of Daniel's question, which is where these things should live. This is a huge architectural debate right now. If you're running a simple custom GPT, it lives on the provider's servers, like OpenAI or Anthropic. You do not worry about the infrastructure. But once you start building these persistent, long-running agentic workflows, you have to decide on a home for them.
Right, because if an agent is supposed to be monitoring something 24/7, or if it takes 10 minutes to reason through a complex task, you can't just run that in a browser tab. You need a server. But do you want a persistent server that you pay for every month, or something serverless?
Let us break that down. For something like Daniel's news agent, which runs once a day, serverless is the obvious winner. You use something like ASO and Lambda or a Vercel function. The code wakes up, runs for 2 minutes, the agent does its thing, and then it vanishes. You only pay for those 2 minutes. It is incredibly cost-effective.
But what about the more complex ones? The ones that need to maintain state? Like an agent that is managing a long-term project and needs to remember what happened 3 days ago without rereading 5,000 tokens of history every time it wakes up.
That is the challenge. For persistent agents, we are seeing a shift toward what people are calling agentic runtimes. These are specialized environments, often running in Docker containers, that stay warm. They keep the agent's memory and the current state of the workspace active. If you were doing heavy coding work with something like Claude Code, you wanted to have immediate access to your local environment. But if you're deploying this for a company, you might use a platform that spins up a dedicated virtual machine for that agent's agents.
It feels like we are moving back toward the idea of a personal server, just a very specialized one. I remember in episode 258 when we talked about the gigabit bottleneck and home networking. It makes me wonder if more people are going to start running agent boxes in their homes, just a little high-powered NUC or a Mac Mini that sits in the closet and hosts all their personal agents so they don't have to pay cloud hosting fees.
I think that is a very real trend for 2026. Especially with local models getting so good, you can run a very capable Llama 3 or Mistral model locally now if you have an agent that is handling sensitive data, like your personal emails or finances. You probably don't want that running on a random server in Virginia. You want it in your house, on your hardware.
Speaking of paying for things, let us take a quick break for our sponsors.
Are you tired of your dreams being just dreams? Do you wake up feeling like your subconscious is underperforming? Introducing the One Aeronautics Helmet by Dreamstream. This revolutionary head-mounted device uses low-frequency vibrations and a proprietary blend of synthetic lavender and ozone to guide your dreams toward maximum productivity. Why sleep when you could be conceptualizing? Users report a 40% increase in imaginary output and only a slight, temporary loss of the ability. Debate yao. They all saved.
I really worry about Larry sometimes. Synthetic lavender and ozone? That sounds like a recipe for a very strange headache.
And the color blue. That is a high price to pay for productivity. Anyway, back to the world of agents. We were talking about deployment, but the real elephant in the room that Daniel mentioned is cost control. This is the thing that keeps people from hitting the deploy button on a multi-agent system.
It is the infinite loop problem. In traditional coding, an infinite loop might crash your program or max out your CPU. In agentic AI, an infinite loop can cost you $500 in 20 minutes. If two agents get into an argument or keep asking each other for clarification without a stop condition, they will just keep burning tokens.
I have seen that happen. It is like two polite people at a door saying, "No, after you," but every time they say it, it costs 10 cents. So, what are the mechanisms for control? How do we build fiscal guardrails into these systems?
There are a few layers to this. The first and most basic is the token cap per run. Every time you trigger an agent, you should have a hard limit on how many tokens it is allowed to consume for that specific task. If it hits the limit, it has to stop and ask for permission to continue. It is like giving your teenager a debit card with a $20 limit instead of your primary credit card.
That makes sense for a single run. But what about Daniel's concern about unpredictability? You don't always know how often an agent will need to run if it is responding to external triggers, like customer emails or market changes.
That is where budget-based rate limiting comes in. You need a middleman. Instead of your agent talking directly to the OpenAI or Anthropic API, it talks to a proxy. That proxy tracks your spending in real time across all your agents. You set a daily or monthly budget, say $50. Once that $50 is hit, the proxy simply shuts down the API keys. Everything stops. It is better to have a broken agent than a $3,000 bill.
I also think there is a design element here. We need to move away from open-ended agents and toward task-specific agents. If an agent has a very narrow scope, it is much less likely to wander off into a token-burning forest.
Absolutely. This is the concept of constrained agency. You don't give the agent the goal of manage my social media. You give it the goal of summarize this one blog post into 3 tweets. By narrowing the objective, you narrow the search space and the potential for runaway reasoning. Also, we are seeing more use of human-in-the-loop checkpoints. For any task that is estimated to cost more than a certain amount, the agent has to send a notification to your phone or Slack. Hey, I can do this, but is it code?
That feels like the most practical solution for most people. It is the "Are you sure?" button for the AI age. I also want to touch on the orchestration part of Daniel's prompt. When you have sub-agents, do they all need to be the smartest and most expensive models?
Definitely not. And that is a huge cost-saving strategy. You use the big brain models like Claude 3.5 Sonnet or GPT-4o for the manager agent, the one doing the high-level reasoning and planning. But for the subtasks, like formatting text, extracting dates, or simple data entry, you use much smaller, cheaper models. You might use a specialized Llama 3.8b model or a Flash model from Google. Those are literally 100 times cheaper.
So, you are building a team where you have one highly paid consultant overseeing a group of very efficient, specialized workers. That is a much more sustainable model than just throwing the most expensive model at every single comma and period.
Exactly. And in 2026, the routing technology has gotten really good. There are frameworks now that automatically look at a task and decide which model is the most cost-effective one to handle it. It is like an automated triage system for AI.
Let us talk about the persistent part of the agents. Daniel mentioned persistent agents being deployed. What does persistence actually mean in this context? Is it just memory, or is it something more?
It is both memory and state. A persistent agent has a soul that lives on between sessions. In 2025, we saw the rise of vector database memory, where an agent could look up things it did months ago. But in 2026, we are moving toward graph-based memory. Instead of just finding similar text, the agent understands the relationships. It knows that project X is related to client Y, and that client Y has a preference for concise emails.
That makes the agent so much more useful over time. It is not just starting from scratch every morning. It is building a knowledge base of how you work. But that also adds to the cost, right? Because every time the agent wakes up, it has to load that context.
It does, which is why context caching has been such a game changer this past year. The API providers finally realized that if we're sending the same 3,000 words of background info every time, they should just cache it on their end and charge us a fraction of the price to reference it. It makes those persistent agents actually affordable.
That is a huge technical detail that I think a lot of people overlook. If you are building an agentic workflow today and you are not using context caching, you are basically throwing money away.
Precisely. Now, looking at Daniel's specific setup with N8N and Claude Code, N8N is fantastic because it gives you that visual map of where the data is going. You can see the nodes, you can see the logic, and you can inject manual approval steps very easily. It is the perfect bridge between pure code and pure autonomy.
I think that is the sweet spot for most developers right now. You don't want a black box where you just hope the agent does the right thing. You want a glass box where you can see the reasoning, intervene if necessary, and have clear visibility into the costs.
And Claude Code represents the other side of that, the embedded agent. It is right there in your terminal. It has the context of your entire codebase. The synergy between those two, a high-level orchestrator like N8N and a deep dive worker like Claude Code is really the blueprint for a modern AI augmented workflow.
So, if we were to give Daniel some concrete takeaways for his project, what would they be? I mean, he is already doing the work, but how does he level it up for 2026?
First, I would say define your agentic boundary. Not everything needs to be an agent. If a simple script can do it, use a script. Save the reasoning for the parts that actually need it. Second, implement a proxy layer for cost control immediately. Don't wait for a surprise build to realize you need a budget cap.
And third, I would add, diversify your models. Don't use a God model for everything. Look at your subtasks and see which ones can be handled by smaller, faster, cheaper models. It is better for your wallet and often faster for the workflow.
Also, don't sleep on local hosting for the persistent parts. If you have an agent that needs to be on all the time, consider a dedicated home server or a low-cost VPS rather than a high-end serverless function that might get expensive with high invocation counts.
This has been a really deep dive, and I think it is such a perfect snapshot of where we are right now. We have moved past the can it do it phase and into the how do we make it sustainable, reliable, and affordable phase.
It is the industrialization of AI. We are building the factories and the supply chains now, not just the prototypes. It is a very exciting time to be a builder, even if it is a bit confusing with all the jargon.
Well, I think we have cleared up at least a little bit of that jargon today. Daniel, thanks for the prompt. Keep us posted on how that news agent evolves. If it starts picking up stories about Larry's helmet, we might need to have a serious talk about its filtering logic.
Or we might need to buy some helmets, Corn. Think of the productivity.
I like the color blue too much, Herman. I'm not risking it. Anyway, if you have been enjoying the show, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Spotify or whatever podcast app you are using. It genuinely helps the show reach more people who are interested in these kinds of deep dives.
It really does. And remember, you can find all our past episodes and a way to get in touch with us at our website, myweirdprompts.com. We love hearing from you, whether you are a long-time listener or just joining us for episode 261.
Thanks for listening to My Weird Prompts. We will be back next week with another exploration into the strange and wonderful world of technology and beyond.
This has been Herman, and Corn. Until next time, stay curious.
See ya!
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox Turbo.
Thanks for listening to another episode of My Weird Prompts, an AI-generated podcast featuring Daniel Rosehill's AI prompts, as answered by a revolving cast of friendly AI characters including me, Cornelius the Sloth. Subscribe on Spotify or visit myweirdprompts.com.